What Dianne Feinstein did today was the single most important act by a United States senator since Donald Trump took the oath of office. Nothing less than that. Senator Feinstein reached the breaking point with her Republican colleagues on the Senate Judiciary Committee. It was her Howard Beale moment, that moment in Patty Chayefsky's Oscar-winning screenplay Network when Howard Beale starts shouting, "I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take this anymore," and the whole country starts shouting with him. There is nothing more rare in the United States Senate than the Howard Beale moment. They happen once in a generation, if that. The last one, as I said to Rachel, the last one that comes to mind for me is from 1984 when Daniel Patrick Moynihan announced his resignation from the vice chairmanship of the Senate Intelligence Committee because the CIA director had violated his obligation to fully and openly brief the committee, privately brief the committee on the mining of the harbors in Nicaragua before going ahead and mining those harbors. The Republican chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee then, Barry Goldwater, was as outraged as his Democratic colleague, Senator Moynihan, and he, too, sharply criticized the CIA for that. Filibusters are commonly mistaken by the press to be Howard Beale moments. They are not. They are perfectly normal and traditional and very rare uses of the Senate rules and procedures to prolong debate. That's all they are. What Senator Moynihan did in 1984 and what Senator Feinstein did today was a break with Senate norms and traditions, something Senator Feinstein was loath to do. In her 25 years in the United States Senate, Dianne Feinstein has mastered the norms and the traditions and the rules of committee procedure and Senate decorum and respect for her colleagues. Some say she has mastered all of that to a fault, to the point of being too deferential to process and traditions, and too deferential to her colleagues, especially her Republican colleagues. I was working in the United States Senate when Dianne Feinstein was first sworn in as a senator. In my experience working with her in the Senate and watching her work as a senator ever since, I could think of no one, and I mean no one, on the Democratic side of the Senate less likely to have a Howard Beale moment than Dianne Feinstein. But in her years in the Senate, especially her last few years in the Senate, the Obama years, and now, worst of all, the Trump year, she has watched Senate tradition, Senate decorum, Senate respect for process, not to mention senatorial integrity, virtually collapse with Republican senators like Lindsey Graham on the Judiciary Committee, who went from trying to expose Donald Trump as a fraud and a charlatan during the presidential campaign to now running interference for him on the Judiciary Committee and trying to steer the Judiciary Committee's investigation of Russian interference in our election away from Donald Trump and the Trump campaign and toward one of the people who believed it was his duty to alert the FBI to what he had discovered about that Russian interference. Christopher Steele, the former British intelligence agent who had written memos now called a dossier on Donald Trump's Russian connections for Fusion GPS. Today, Senator Feinstein decided to release the 312-page transcript of testimony about that dossier that the Republican chairman of the committee, Chuck Grassley, was refusing to release. Now, normally, testimony given to the committee privately behind closed doors would only be released as a result of an agreement by the chairman of the committee and the ranking member. But Dianne Feinstein violated that tradition and just released it herself. Ranking member is a term that has absolutely no meaning outside the Capitol Hill campus of the United States Congress. It is the title that goes to the highest ranking member of the minority party on a Senate committee, the person who would be chair of that committee if her party was in the majority. In the old days of the Bush and Clinton era, that distant period, ranking members on committees that operated in true bipartisan style had real power. Not even half the power of the chairman, but more power than anyone else in the minority. Chairmen and ranking members of committees always try to use the power of their seniority in their re-election campaigns, but very few voters ever notice that or care about it. It's not exactly the rousing part of a campaign speech to say, hey, I'm the ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and therefore. In this Republican Congress, in the House and in the Senate, the ranking members on the committees are largely powerless, largely ignored, until today. Today, Dianne Feinstein taught all of her Senate colleagues on both sides of the aisle the lesson that we are all supposed to already know. Extraordinary times require extraordinary measures. Almost since the day Glenn Simpson was interviewed by the Senate Judiciary Committee staff on August 22nd of 2017 about the dossier that his firm, Fusion GPS, commissioned Christopher Steele to write, his testimony has been lied about by Republican senators. Chairman Grassley publicly called that testimony, which he refused to release, quote, uncooperative. Glenn Simpson wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times last week urging the committee to release his testimony. The person Chuck Grassley was accusing of being uncooperative wanted to show us how cooperative he actually was with the committee. Chuck Grassley was never going to release that transcript. And Senator Feinstein knew it. And so today, Dianne Feinstein willfully took an action that humiliated the chairman of her committee, Chuck Grassley, something she hated to do. And in the process, she proved that the chairman of her committee has been lying about Glenn Simpson's testimony, publicly lying about it. The transcript shows that Glenn Simpson was fully cooperative, as he described Christopher Steele and himself believing they were witnessing a crime in progress. Those were his words, crime in progress, with Russian interference in the election. And while Senator Feinstein was at it today, she participated in a bipartisan meeting with the president in the cabinet room about immigration policy, in which she forcefully led the president to an agreement to quickly pass legislation legally resolving the status of young beneficiaries of the DACA program, which provoked Republicans to immediately jump in panic and try to steer the president back to his own position of holding any such legislative progress hostage to building a wall. We'll have more on how Senator Feinstein cornered the president today later in this hour. But first, we'll consider what we've learned today from Glenn Simpson's testimony, thanks entirely to the bold use of the power of the ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Dianne Feinstein.